Hello and welcome to this training program about the radio interview. We're going to be looking specifically at the recorded interview, but many of the principles you'll learn you'll be able to apply to the live interview as well. We're going to be looking at what is an interview, how does it differ from other radio formats, why use an interview, why not use, say for instance, a drama or a voice piece? When should you interview? When are you ready? Who should you interview? Because not everybody is a good interviewee, so how do you know who to choose? Where should you interview? Is it always best to be in the studio, or is it good sometimes to be out on location? And how long should the interview last? Is the time slot for which it's meant the only determining factor, or are there other things to bear in mind? We'll also talk about good tips on interviewing, and we'll show you the use of the portable recording machine. Now, why do we use interviews in radio? Why are they so important? Well, of course, it's such a useful tool. Whether it's being used as a format in and of itself for a complete program, or whether you're using it within other programming formats such as the current affairs program or the documentary or the feature. And the thing about an interview is that it gives the opportunity for somebody who may be totally inexperienced in radio to actually have a voice, to be able to express their opinion through the interview. And as the interviewer, you need to remember that you're there to represent all the listeners, not just those that agree with your opinion. And so now let's move on to look at what is an interview.
Interviewing is a means of providing facts.
An interview is where the interviewer asks the interviewee questions and getting answers for the benefit of the listener.
An interview is to inform listeners, is to give them information what they need to know, or maybe not need to know, but the information that they want to hear.
An interview is a spontaneous event. Any hint that an interview is rehearsed will damage the credibility of the interviewing party in the ears of the listener. The listener might think it's fixed.
An interview is a conversation with an aim of getting something out of it.
A conversation with an aim. Yes, that is one way to describe an interview. But one thing that an interview must never become is a discussion. Don't get drawn into discussions with the interviewee. Don't get drawn into giving your opinions and showing your prejudices. You're there to represent the listener and to ask the questions they want asked. And so don't put yourself forward as being more important than the interviewee. Sometimes that can be a great temptation, especially if you're somebody that's fairly well known. Of course, the kind of program that you're going to use your interview in will determine what type of interview it is. Is it an interview with somebody about their life and their experiences? Or is it an interview with an expert or a key player about the knowledge they have or their views and opinions on a certain subject? So now we've looked at what an interview is, let's see an example of one with a lady who's sharing her experiences.
Would you like to define ADD and ADHD?
Good morning, Lynette, and thank you. Yes, ADD is attention deficit disorder and ADHD is attention deficit hyperactive disorder.
How was your son diagnosed?
Robin was diagnosed for having ADD. He's very intelligent, but his social skills are very low.
So there are two types of ADD or ADHD, and you have mentioned the one your son is the antisocial one and highly intelligent.
Correct, Lynette.
What is the other one?
The other one is the vice versa, where you have very good social skills but you are not very intelligent. And what comes down to that is that a child will study the whole night, for the whole evening for a maths test, and the next morning will not remember the 2 or the 5 times table.
So now we know what an interview is, but in radio there are all sorts of formats we could use for putting our point across. So why use an interview?
People are usually, they're interested in people. People like themselves, people are not like themselves, people that think like them, people that don't think like them. Just they want to get to know how people think and what they're about and what makes them tick and that sort of thing. As far as interviews are concerned, well, 2 voices are usually better than 1. It makes for a much bigger variety in your interview.
Yes, the points he makes are very good. But of course there are other good reasons for using an interview. For instance, it's a good way of getting the expert involved. I mean, you want to look at a subject, for instance, and you can go to books or websites and find out all the facts and figures that you want. But if you interview somebody who's really enthusiastic about that subject, it'll be so much more interesting than somebody just delivering a factual voice piece. And then there's the other aspect of human interest, for instance. If you wanted to find out about the Philippines, again, you could go to books, you could look at maps. But if you talk to me about the Philippines, because I've been there, I hope that I could give you a very interesting interview which shows the enthusiasm I have for the place. So I think I've shown you there reasons why an interview is good. But how do you know when you're ready for an interview?
I think you should have proper research and correct research on both the interviewee and the subject in hand. Your interview should be fully prepared so that it can give the listener a sense that you are now confident of what is being spoken about.
You do an interview when you have a clear and specific goal in mind. You want to share certain facts, you want to find out facts. You need to be specific as to what you want to achieve with the interview.
Yes, it's very important that you know what you want to achieve with your interview. Are you wanting just to establish facts and figures? Or are you wanting to discuss reasons and views and emotions? Be clear about that before you do the interview. And the other point that was made there is very important. Do your research. When you go to interview somebody, make sure that you know their correct name, their correct title. Make sure you've done some research on the subject itself. Here's an example based on a real-life situation of somebody who didn't do their research.
How are you enjoying your visit to London, Mr.
Lewandowski?
Thank you. Have you any thoughts of settling down here?
Well, I've lived here for the past 23 years, so I suppose you could say I'm settled.
I'm sorry, but I thought you normally live in Poland.
Poland? I've never lived in Poland, no.
But that's odd, surely.
Well, I never wanted to live in Poland, so I've never lived there. It doesn't seem odd to me.
But you are Polish, aren't you?
No.
There you go. There's an example of what can happen if you're not well prepared. And another thing you need to be sure of before you go and do your interview is the general direction you want your interview to go in. What kind of questions you should ask. And we'll look at that later. Another thing that you need to do is to prepare your interviewee for the interview. For instance, they may be a little bit nervous and apprehensive, and you need to be able to put them at their ease. Also, if you are expecting them to share some facts and figures, let them know beforehand so they can bring the relevant details to the interview. And also point out little things that may become a problem technically, such as them clicking their biros or tapping their feet, things like that, because they may not be aware they're even doing it. So just point these things out and help them to be more relaxed.
How many people have you talked to in the last 2 months?
I'm sorry?
How many people have you talked to in the last 2 months?
Oh, at least about 20 or 30 or so.
Which part of the country?
Sorry, I didn't get the question.
Which part of the country? Probably.
Mostly Cape Town, but also other parts of the country as well.
But of course, before you do any of this, you need to decide who is the right person to be interviewed. And how do you decide that?
When deciding who to interview, it would be an excellent idea to get somebody who is an expert in a particular field and can speak with authority on that topic.
I think who should be interviewed are people who are related to the matter, people who've got knowledge to the subject, and the people who have done the research for that particular subject or for that particular field.
Yes, very good points that were raised there. But I'd just like to mention something in relation to the expert. Somebody may be an expert, but that doesn't make them an interesting interviewee. They could be very boring, and you don't want to put your listeners off. And also, conversely, somebody may not be an expert, but may be an excellent interviewee because they've got a really interesting story to tell. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're only interesting if you have all the education and the facts and the figures. And when it comes to interviewing somebody who's been closely involved in a situation, be sensitive to how they're feeling at that time. It may be that at that moment they're too emotionally upset because of what they've seen or what they've experienced to actually give you a good interview. So don't push for it at that point. Wait until it's a good time. So we've looked at who we should interview. Next, we should look at what kind of questions should we ask.
In an interview, the presenter should ask open questions that will provide full answers. Example, what, where, who, when, etc. Questions leading to yes and no should be avoided.
Is motivational speaking profitable?
No.
Do you like motivational speaking?
Yes, I do.
Do people enjoy it?
I don't really know.
Well, that interviewee was particularly difficult. But it isn't always true to say, of course, that if you use a closed question, you're going to get short answers. Often interviewees will give you nice long answers, even though you've asked a very closed question. But generally speaking, go for the open question. And if you do ask a closed question, try and follow it up with an open one, which will draw them out more. And the best open question you can ask is always the question why, because the question why gets to the heart of the matter. It gets them to explain why they did something, the emotions within them that made them do whatever it was they did or say whatever it was they said. Now let's look at the best place to do an interview. Of course, if you want a good interview technically, then the best place is the studio. But that might not give you the atmosphere that you're looking for. It may be that you want to go on location to a person's home or to their workplace, or possibly to the place where the action's taking place, like a sporting stadium, for instance. But be aware that there are certain pitfalls if you go to these places. If you're outside, listen out for all the background noise that's going on. Is it going to make your editing difficult? Listen to this example and you'll see what I mean.
I am, yes. People can contact me at any time of the day, during office hours as well. And my contact numbers are 021 788 9492, or they can email me at lynnbaker@worldonline.
If you do an interview indoors, be aware of some of the pitfalls there. For instance, is there a ticking clock in the background or a clock that's going to chime on the hour? Is there a refrigerator switching on and off? Or is there a telephone that may ring? Sorry, but I'm busy. Bye. Be aware of these distractions because when you come to editing, it might be quite difficult if you've got these noises going on in the background. The second thing you need to be aware of is the acoustics of the room. Is it an office like this with lots of hard surfaces, or the kitchen? If it is, try to avoid that because the sound will be very echoey. The best place to do an interview is in somewhere with soft furnishings like the lounge, where there's a carpet and a settee, because that way you'll get a much nicer, more mellow sound. But what do you do if your interviewee can't come to you in the studio and you can't go to them because perhaps they live in another town or even another country? Well then, there's the option of the telephone interview. But you need to be aware of two things if you do a telephone interview. First of all, make sure you have a good line so that the listener will be able to hear the interviewee clearly. And secondly, be aware of the balance between you in the studio and your interviewee so that it doesn't sound too peculiar. Okay, now let's go on to look at how long should an interview last.
It will need to fit in the time slot that's needed, as long as it is interesting.
Yes, that's right. The program that the interview has to go into will determine the length of the interview. It may be that you just want a short 1-minute interview, for instance, or possibly 15 to 20 minutes. And of course you need to be aware of the slot that's allocated to the interview before you go out and do it. Now, if the slot that your interview is to fit into is, say, 3 minutes long, don't record material more than 7 or 8 minutes, because otherwise if you record more, say 10, 15, even 20 minutes, which people have done, then it makes editing really difficult to try and cut so much material down to 3 minutes. So that's how you can keep an interview to the right time for the slot that it's allocated for. But of course the most important thing about an interview is that it's interesting. And so you must be certain that even if it's exactly the right length, that it's also interesting for that time. And here are some tips on how to keep it interesting.
The interviewee and the interviewer need to stick to the subject. There needs to be relevance.
So as with all radio programs, the most important thing is your listener. Is the interview relevant for the listener, or is it only interesting for you and your interviewee? And of course that defines the kind of questions that you're going to be asking. Are you asking the questions your listener would ask if they were in your place?
The questions being asked should not be repetitive. This gives the listener a sense that you are not confident of what you're speaking about, and also that you do not have enough research.
Yes, of course, in an interview, the questions are very important. Make sure that the questions you ask are clear and understandable, that they can't be misinterpreted. Now, one thing that I often hear in interviews is where the interviewer asks multiple questions in one go, and the poor interviewee is left wondering which of those questions they're supposed to be answering. So don't use the word "and" as you're asking questions. Just ask one question and leave it at that. Another thing you must be careful to do is not to sum up in your own words what the interviewee has said, or to comment on what they've said.
Keep your prejudices and opinions to yourself. You are representing a whole host of people, not only the ones who think like you do.
One thing it's very important to avoid is to say yes, 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 or grunt whilst your interviewee is speaking. Just let them know that you're listening by nodding their head or smiling and keeping eye contact so that they are aware that you really are listening to them. Now, with regard to your questions, it may help you to write down the main questions you want to ask. That way you can be sure that you cover everything that you want to cover. But don't be so rigid as to only use those questions no matter what. Your interviewee might say something of real interest that you weren't aware of before, and you may want to follow that up. There's a quote I often use that goes, "An interviewer's greatest skill lies in discovering something within each answer which provides a stepping stone to the next question." And that's the key. Listen to your interviewee, because that way your interview will flow much more naturally.
My next question in the list: how do you know that you are affecting the lives of people in a positive way?
I know that I'm affecting them in a positive way by their reaction to me, and also from the feedback I get after I've spoken.
Would you encourage others to follow the same profession?
I would, yes.
Then my last question, are you available for talks?
I am available indeed, yes.
See, as you saw, if you just are determined to read your set questions, the interview can end up sounding very wooden. And not only that, it may be that a question you ask seems completely irrelevant because it doesn't have any relationship to the previous answer that your interviewee gave you. That's why it's so important to listen. And in fact, many famous interviewers have said that the reason why they're good at what they do is because they've learned to listen. Something else you need to be aware of is not to allow yourself to become distracted. Maybe there are things going on around you that could distract you, possibly things going on in your own mind and you're not really listening to what your interviewee is saying. Or quite commonly, the machine can become a distraction.
Are you available for talks?
I am, yes. If anybody wants to contact me, they can either phone or fax or email.
Can one get in contact with you?
As somebody once said, an unwatched machine may sometimes let you down. An interviewee who senses that you're only half listening will always let you down. In any interview, there aren't just the two people, the interviewee and the interviewer, there's also the listener, as we've mentioned before. And this relationship between these three people is what we call the triangle of trust. And every person in this triangle, the interviewee, the interviewer and the listener, are of equal importance.
The people who are being interviewed, they should be able to be honest to the listeners and to the presenter about what they are discussing.
Robert McLeish is a former broadcast trainer with the BBC, and in his book Radio Production, he says this with regard to the triangle of trust. Every time a broadcaster misrepresents, every time an interviewee lies or a listener disbelieves, we have lost something of genuine value. Now, it's important as the interviewer that you keep control of the interview. You may be interviewing somebody who's very passionate about their subject and they go on and on and on, or possibly, say, a politician who's got a particular point they want to make and they may just keep on talking about it. But you have to keep control and you need to find ways of breaking into that interview. You can do it, for instance, with eye contact, or if they stop to take a breath, maybe come in at that point and ask the question you want to ask.
When do you start this motivational speaking?
Oh, I started it many years ago. I think at least about 10 years ago. And from there it just snowballed, absolutely snowballed. And so as a result, I mean, there's so many demands upon my...
Where was this?
Just let me finish. There's so many demands upon my time, and the people that I need to see, I just don't get a chance to see them.
The question is...
It's absolutely incredible.
Where did you start this?
Of course, losing control of an interview isn't always about the interviewee going on and on and on. It may be the interviewee doesn't give you enough material, and so you need to coax them and to encourage them, help them to be relaxed so that they feel free to share more openly with you. And another way you can lose control of an interview is by allowing the interviewee to dodge your question and to refuse to answer the question that you're asking.
During your time as Transport Minister, Mr. Hay, have the railways improved?
If you look at the data from April last year, it is clear that the rate of the change of the growth of the development of the improvements within the transport system, well, the results really speak for themselves.
Is that a yes or a no, Mr. Hay?
Well, let me give you an example. I was on a train in Brighton just the other day. It was brand new, it was clean, it was efficient, it made me proud.
Mr. Hay, we are not interested in specific information. We want to know as a whole, has our railway system visibly improved?
As I say, if you look at the data, we're bringing in new tracks, we're bringing in new trains.
Mr. Hay, a yes or a no?
Well, if you look at the data, it is clear to see that the rate of the change of the growth of the development of the interquartile percentage
Please,
range...
give us a yes or a no, Mr. Hay. Have they improved?
You really must let me speak here. The growth...
I would like an answer, a yes or no, a definitive yes or no. Thank you very much.
Of course, if your interviewee does refuse to answer your question, no matter how many times you ask it, then the listener will very likely realise that they've got something to hide, and the point will have been made. What you need to remember, though, is no matter what happens with your interviewee, always be polite to them, never be rude. Even if they've been rude to you, it may be that you want them to come back at a later date, and if you've been rude to them, they might never want to see you again.
Treat people with respect. Alan Wicker once said, "Whoever I'm talking to is the most important person at that moment."
So we've looked at interviews, what they are, why we use them, when we use them, and where's the best place to record them. Is it best in a studio like this one, or is it best to go out on location? And in relation to going out on location, of course, we also need to think about portable recording machines. There are all types that are available, but Dick Davis is now going to show us how to use the mini-disc.
Well, mini-discs like this are a great way of being able to record material out of the studio. If you look carefully, you can see that inside there's a disc, and it looks a little bit like a compact disc, and it is, but it records, and that's what makes it great for us for recording out of the studio. And for that, you'll need a machine a little bit like this one. This is a Sony mini-disc recorder. Very small. I'm afraid the buttons are very tiny, and the display is quite small, but it makes excellent quality recordings. The other equipment you're going to need to make a recording is a microphone to record with. And we always use a microphone separate from the machine that we're recording on. This is a microphone by the same people that made the mini-disc recorder, and it's made by Sony. And this will plug into the side of the mini-disc recorder. It's quite important that when you buy a mini-disc recorder that you check that there is a socket for a microphone, because some don't have one. It's normally red in colour. So here's the microphone plug going into the socket on the mini-disc machine. Then, of course, you're going to need to be able to listen to the recordings you make, and for that you'll need some headphones. And I'm going to put those on and plug those into the headphone socket on the mini-disc machine like that. Now I'm ready to record. I have all the equipment that I need to make a good recording out of the studio. Okay, first thing I'm going to do is put the disc in, and as I place the disc in and click the door shut, you should see on the display that eventually the display will say blank disc because the disc I've put in has been erased. The next thing I'm going to do is push the end search button. It's marked along the top there, and that makes sure that we're at the end of the recorded section of the disc. The way to place it into record mode is to push down the little red button and push that slider across. And as you can see, the machine sets itself in recording mode. And if I speak into the microphone, you'll see the sound on the display. As my voice is speaking, the volume is going up and down in the display on the machine. Now I've just placed it in record, and you'll notice there's a number here saying 002. This is because this is the second track on this disc. A mini disc can have many tracks, and each track is really the separate recording that you've made. And every time you push the stop button to stop the recording, you'll see that the display first says data save, and then it says TOC edit. Now that's the process of the mini disc machine writing the recording onto the little disc. Once that's done, then you'll see the display will show end 002, and that means that it's at the end of track 2. It's recorded 2 tracks. If I put it in record again, like that, you'll see eventually that the display will say 003, which means it's now recording track 3. When it's finished recording track 3 and I push the stop button, the display will again show that the disc is being written with the information, with the data save and the TOC edit, and then it will say end 003, the end of track 3. So now we have all the equipment and we've got an idea on how to start and stop the recording on the machine, but we now need to go and make a recording. So here's 1 or 2 hints and tips on how to get the best out of that. First of all, remember that the microphone needs to be put in the right place. You need to be in the right place to gather the sound you want to hear. The microphone has no brain of its own. Only you can decide what it will record by directing it at the sound you want it to hear. Go to somewhere that's not too noisy, because you don't want too much extra noise. Maybe you'll have to choose somewhere where there are a lot of people because you want to interview different people. Make that choice carefully. Also, be aware of the fact that where you're outside, the wind will make a sound on the microphone.
Secondly, it's important that they both know the subject matter to be discussed. Obviously, the interviewee will know his or her subject matter because that's what they're passionate about.
It's quite objectionable, so maybe shield it with your body. Maybe go somewhere where there's less wind. Maybe you can use one of these on the microphone. It reduces some of the effect of wind noise. Now you're ready to start recording. Let's think about the microphone first. First of all, make sure it is switched on. There's a switch on the microphone, and this one's in the on position when it's up. Then hold it gently but firmly in the hand, not too firmly. I know you'll be nervous, but the person you're interviewing doesn't know you'll be nervous. So hold the microphone gently. Perhaps take a little loop of the cable through your little finger like that. This will prevent the cable banging against anything and introducing any extra noises in the recording. So with your microphone in your hand, comfortably but not too firmly, in a relaxed grip with a microphone cable like that, we can now start recording. So I'll put the machine into record, and now it's started recording and I can make my recording. Now the microphone, when it's recording speech, is often good at about 1 hand span away from the mouth of the person you're recording. So that's not a bad position for placing the microphone. Okay, so that's pretty well all you need to know about making good recordings out of the studio using equipment like this. It's quite straightforward, it's easy to do, and I think it makes radio great fun.
So, you've done your interview and now the time has come to edit it. The first thing to do is make sure you listen through the whole thing first of all without doing any cutting, and decide which bits you definitely want to keep and which bits you definitely want to throw away. After you've done that, then you can do the fine-tuning. Now, the most important thing you must remember when you're doing editing is the ethics of editing. You must make sure that when you edit, you don't change the meaning of what was said by your interviewee, or that you don't change the context and put it in a context that it was never meant for. If you do that, then you're losing credibility as an interviewer. And so there we are. We've given you some guidelines for interviewing in this training program. And as I said before, they're used in the recorded interview, such as is used in documentaries and features and the news report, for instance. But generally speaking, the same principles can also apply to the live interview. So, as they say, practice makes perfect, and this is now your opportunity to go out there and practice. Interview as often as you can and as many people as you can. And if you're passionate about radio and about interviewing, then I'm sure, like me, you're going to enjoy yourself. One of the things that I found the most interesting is interviewing people who are really enthusiastic about their subject and giving them the opportunity to share their enthusiasm, not just with me, but also with the most important person in radio, the listener.